Hey everyone, welcome to Dev Interrupted. I'm your host, Connor Bronson, and today I'm joined by Mark Cruth, Atlassian's resident modern work expert and evangelist. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Connor. Super excited to be here. It's going to be
Yeah.
awesome.
I completely agree. Mark and I were talking right before the show about how we both love to just kind of dive into the details and aren't going to follow the talk track that producers give us. So this is going to be a really fun one, I think.
Going
Excited
off
to have-
off the road here. Hey, that's how you innovate. You get off the beaten path.
yeah, sometimes you get lost too, though. So hopefully we'll avoid that.
We'll find our way back.
Yeah, it'll wander back. One of the reasons I'm really excited to have you on is not only are you an excellent speaker and you're armed with some really cool data that Atlassian has, you're also an Interact speaker. So you may have just heard, if you're listening to this episode, a commercial for Interact. It's our flagship conference. I'm going to keep it brief. It's going to be a ton of fun. Mark will be there. Thank you, Mark. And joining Atlassian and all the other incredible logos on our speaker list will be folks from stellar companies like Slack, Shopify, Stripe, Clockwise, and many more. It's October 25th. It's completely free. It's virtual. There's a link in the show notes. We'll see you there. Now, Mark, I alluded to it earlier. You have some very interesting data to share with us. We love data here at Linear B. If you're not watching the video, Mark's stroking his beard here, which you'll see me do.
That's what we do when we talk about data.
That's why we have the beards. Come on.
Exactly.
And you have a statistic that I'm reading here that 83% of teams have something holding them back. Or to put it another way, only 17% of teams are considered truly healthy. Now, we should qualify this a little bit. These numbers are from the State of Teams report by Atlassian. Let's start with a bit of an intro. Mark, can you introduce yourself to the audience and what you do at Atlassian, and maybe then we'll dive into the report a bit?
Yeah, I'll tell you who I am and just kind of tell you a little bit about that report because it is a really interesting kind of statistic there. So, listeners out there, my name is Mark Cruth. I am what you call a modern work evangelist at Atlassian. And you might wonder, like, how did you get a title like that? And really what it came down to is I've spent my whole career working as a coach, a developer, working to actually get stuff done day to day. And for me, that's where I like to play. I like to solve problems now. And I like to deal with what we're kind of considering today, modern work. This is post-pandemic. How are we working today? I don't care about what's going to happen in 2030 at this point. We can let the future stay where the future is because 3 years ago, we thought we had an idea what the future was going to be. And then we all know how that played out. So for me, I love focusing on the things we do today to get better, just those little inches here and there. And so for me, as I work with Atlassian, one of my passions has always been about our practices. And so I found an opportunity to be able to merge my love for kind of getting stuff done with the practices that have helped us get stuff done over the years. And so I go out there and I talk to organizations, teams, groups about the practices from Atlassian, but also share my stories. I'm still working with teams today, helping them find those inches around the place and going out sharing those stories. So coming on to things like today's podcast to be able to kind of tell you about, some of the things we find, but then also my anecdotal experience in terms of saying, hey, it's not just facts and figures. There's some stories behind this too.
I'm really regretting not just asking you, how did you get that amazing title? Because you told this great story of it. It would have been a better lead in.
Hey, there we go. You know what? That we're storytellers
Better
here, right, Connor? That's what we do.
So what is the State of Teams report that you mentioned?
So last year, and so 2021, one of the things that Atlassian got focused on, and it's always been focused on, if you're familiar with our mission, unleash the potential of every team. We are very focused on how do teams work? How do they get better? We've got products to help support that. But in the end, it's the practices, the ways of working that helps get stuff done. And so we decided to launch an initiative that says, you know what, let's kind of go out there and kind of find out what's going on. And so we launched this initial study that went out and found, what was the state of teamwork? Things like team health, which we'll talk about a little bit as we go here in terms of what does that mean? Things like where you work, the impact of that, things like how you collaborate, how you align with others. And so we ran through our first report last year, got some great feedback. And so we completed our second iteration coming at the beginning of this year. So we released our State of Teams 2.0 at the beginning of, and I think it was in March of just this last year. And so one of the things that we've spent a lot of time focusing on in this one is how do we start looking at patterns now? We've got a data point from last year. Now let's start seeing how things change. Where are we looking at? How has health changed? How has remote versus hybrid versus in office? How is things like engagement, all those kind of fun things. So this report is dedicated to really understanding teams. And one of the cool things is we're continuing to do it. One thing we'll kind of talk about, I think as we wrap this up is that we're doing another one right now. And there's some cool findings that we may share in a upcoming conference that we may have mentioned on this podcast
Yeah,
already.
may have mentioned a few times.
Maybe.
I really like this idea of we're going to evaluate how teams are working. Obviously, I think a lot of folks are starting to do that, but also doing it for specifically for modern work and looking at like how can we aggregate marginal gains across the board for these teams? Because to reference what you said about inches, right? Like there are little places you can just make a difference now that go so far to reverberate
Okay.
across the organization.
You don't have to you don't have to up dip the apple cart to actually get things better. You don't have to go in there like we're going to go through a major transformation or we're going to do that. Shoot, even some of our data has indicated that transformations, although successful, actually lead to things like turnover and just this feeling of burnout. Those are things that yes, they're impactful, but the thing is we can get to that same destination in a much more progressive way.
How did you aggregate this data? How was it collected?
We surveyed, at least for the State of Teams 2.0, we surveyed roughly 1,500 individuals across the US and Australia, two major hubs for us. And so these are non Atlassians, these are knowledge workers, so folks who are spending their time solving complex problems. They range anywhere in age from, I think it was like 21 to 65. So we have a good demographic spread across different types of teams, different types of individuals and teams. And so what we did is we simply surveyed them. Had a 15-minute survey. We were able to collect that data, and then we've got a actual whole research team on staff. I mean, PhDs who are actually going through the data and looking for actual like statistical significance in that. Like, is there something an interesting pattern here? Let's dive deeper into it, kind of thing.
And I saw this opening line to the report. It's not where
Yeah.
you work, but how you work that makes teams thrive. So I'm guessing that's a lot of what you saw in the data.
So I'm going to tell this to your listeners here, and I might make some enemies, and then it always happens. It doesn't matter where you work. You could be in the office, you could be hybrid, you could be remote. Things like team health, no impact. Now, that's a little bit of a fib. And the only reason I say that is that we did find that there's a range, and healthy teams, anywhere from like 15 to 20% is kind of where the number of healthy teams are. 18 and 20% of those numbers are with the remote and the hybrid. 15% of office workers are healthy. So the data indicates that you're a little better off if you're actually hybrid or remote, but it doesn't actually play that much into the grand scheme. And I think the big thing I wanted to bring out with this is that is the sexy thing today. Everybody's talking about this. It's got all the main headlines. But the problem is we're fixated on honestly the wrong thing. We're fixated on this problem because I think we can all relate to it, but the actual underlying issues have to do with those modern work problems. It has to do with the things that, guess what? Teams are really struggling with engagements. Teams are struggling with how they align with each other and connect with each other. These are the things that actually lead to these unhealthy teams and, ultimately cause things like turnover, ultimately cause things like, you hear that term out there, which I'm not a big fan of, but that term quiet quitting, basically lack of engagement. Those are things that result in that.
So you're using this term healthy teams. Can you define that a bit more so we can be specific?
Yeah. So what we do is in terms of healthy teams, we actually have four elements of that. It's made up of what we consider team engagement, which is enthusiasm. Like, do you want to be here? Do you love working with this group? Performance. So we actually are looking at things like, is your team effective at what they do? Things like climate, we call it team climate. It really is kind of the culture of the team. What are the behaviors that you see within your group that you support? And then finally, we have this idea of team sustainability. This is that idea of do we see this team for as a long live? Do we see this team as a group that can continue on at its current pace? And so we look at each one of those elements, and those make up a number of different questions in our survey. And then when we pull that data back, we then weight those against each other to kind of come up with like, all right, maybe you're super enthusiastic about your work, but you know what? Your sustainability and your climate, these sorts of things just aren't really cutting it. You may be lower in your health scores at that point. But if you're, knocking it out of the park with all of them, you're likely in a very healthy team.
Are there particular areas where you saw teams struggle more? So let's say, was it the healthy team climate was the issue for more teams, or was it
Mhm.
psychological safety, something else?
We had a couple areas that definitely popped up. So, and I think it comes down to it is when we looked at like the team health scores, some of the major reasons why teams were unhealthy had to do with things like that connection back to the organization. So a little bit of that climate, a little bit of that culture, not necessarily feeling connected to things like the organizational goals, not feeling like the organization is empowering them to kind of take ownership. So we think about the behaviors that the organization kind of enables. All of a sudden, the teams are a reflection of that. And if you've kind of got some very traditional ways of trying to run teams with a little bit of command and control, narrow decision making, things like that, the team culture, team climate is going to suffer for that. We did find though that you start seeing the inverse of that. You start seeing organizations that actually are supporting that, decentralizing decision makings. That's where you see that spike. And that's where we started seeing more or less healthy teams are ones that exhibited great connection back to their organization and really, strong like things like psychological safety in their organization, meaning they could speak up and there's no fear of reprisal. It's not that idea of like, do I want to speak up? There's no reason I can't speak up. So those are some cool things that we started seeing pop out of those elements.
I've heard that decentralization of authority piece be referred to as like leading from every seat, right? Where you want to
Mhm.
enable people as leaders throughout the org. Was that something that you found to be more common in hybrid or fully remote teams?
Interesting. So I can't say I know in our data if that is directly connected in there. What I can say though is that based on the holistic data, what we're seeing is that teams that do encourage that idea of leading from every seat, that idea of how do we push decisions down to the team, that psychological ownership that starts coming over the ability to kind of steer your own ship definitely drove things around, a feeling of engagement and autonomy by the teams. This idea that, hey, I can go forward and we don't have to wait for a decision from someone, or I have the most knowledge, I can make that decision. So we did find that in our base data that essentially decentralization of decisions is one of those leading indicators to help the team kind of say, am I in an environment that is really supporting team growth?
Yeah, and there's been a lot of data that says that feeling connected to your work and like you can actually make an impact is what
Yeah.
makes people happy and keeps them there. So
Oh
to your
yeah.
point about
Right.
transformation, that definitely aligns.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And one of the things I'd be interested in, Connor, in terms of your world, I mean, what have you seen in terms of like decentralization? How would you describe that in your teams that you work with? Do you feel like you've kind of got that? And if so, how does that help you perform?
Yeah. So I think for our team here, we definitely, it's something we're continually trying to iterate on and do a better job of. And I kind of aspire to something that Darren Murph from GitLab talked about
Mm,
with us last year, where he said for particularly for hybrid and remote teams, so we're largely remote, but we have a couple of offices. So we qualify as hybrid. I think you have to really reconsider how you do asynchronous work versus just throwing yourself into Zoom all the time. And this is where I think that decentralized decision making
mhm.
comes into real play, where people need to feel empowered to take things on their own. And as a leader myself, like I've struggled with this sometimes to make sure that every member of my team knows they can just jump on the things they're owning and really take charge because it's something I want to enable. And I think it's something that to be honest, like, I learn a lot from the guests like yourself who are coming to the show who talk about this because it's a common theme of the top leaders is they're not only leading themselves, but they are building up leadership within their organizations.
Yep.
Because to your point, that creates psychological safety, that creates that healthy team climate. So I think that
And one thing
definitely
I'll say, it's not necessarily in our data, but it's anecdotal experience here. I've seen working with our customers is that we're starting to see a very strong uptick in this focus on things like leadership development to exactly your point because of the fact that as we start working in this more asynchronous way, we start realizing that this is the way we're going to work from here on out. How do we lead in an environment like this compared to before? And the thing is, the way we led when maybe we were all together. A lot of my career, I'd been in an office, and you know what? My team was all around me, and we could communicate very well together. And then all of a sudden, I get pulled out. I can't communicate as well. There's that balance of where do I lean? Do I lean heavy on that aspect of, all right, I've kind of almost got to micromanage to just feel like I'm in the loop versus where do I pull back and encourage maybe new ways to asynchronously, understand what's happening? Do we have some agreed on ways we as a team are going to keep each other connected? And so it's been really interesting to watch companies now start making some heavy investment in terms of what does real people leadership look like? And that's going to be stuff that as we continue to do our research in the teams, we're going to continue to pull on those strings because understanding, the state of leadership on these teams is going to be a direct correlation to, that health of that team.
So when you're talking to leaders and they're thinking about what to change,
Mhm.
what are the things you think they should be paying attention to coming out of this report?
So I think some of the big pieces that we at least are focused on in this is going to be things such as, honestly, how do we focus on the value that the organization produces? And honestly, how do we empower teams better? And what I mean by this is it goes back to decentralization, find techniques to do that. I'm a big fan of there's a kind of a philosophy, a set of techniques out there called Management 3.0 that came out of some of the agility movements. And like one of the techniques I've used many times in my past to help just find those inches out there and encourage decentralization is this idea of it's called planning or it's called delegation poker. And it's this whole idea of working with a group and saying, what are the decisions we've got to make and determining hey, who needs to make what type of decisions and where do I play in that decision making process? So for us as a leaders out there trying to figure out, well, how do I empower my teams? Well, there's some great exercises like that. You can
With
go run
poker.
with your teams to just find those inches, like find a little piece of the value. The other things we kind of find there too are things like honestly getting to know the human. I think back when we were in the office, we took for granted getting to know the human. We got some
Have
of
that
that through osmosis.
conversation.
Oh yeah,
Share the ball.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, we both go grab a coffee, and I'd hear about what's going on in your life. And I might not even be talking. I might have just been passing by, and I'm like, oh, okay, so that's what's happened with Connor. Now all of a sudden we don't have that, and so we've almost become a little bit more. I don't know.
Siloed almost in our cult, like
Yeah,
power
maybe
control.
siloed. It's almost like we're becoming a little bit we've got much more of like a mask on
Mm.
around things. Like it feels like sometimes, we can't have those candid conversations like we used to because there's not a space for that anymore.
And that's so
And so,
interesting because like at the same time, I have a video streamed directly into your home right now. I can see your lightsaber.
you can
Yeah.
see
Right.
all my Legos and all
Yeah.
that stuff that make up Mark.
So it's this weird dichotomy. You're right, where we
Yes.
have more access to people than ever before. Like
Yeah.
I'm on Slack far too late at night sometimes. Not
Yes.
necessarily a healthy behavior, I'll note. And yet at the same time, a lot of it has transformed into work focused versus
Mm.
missing that kind of connection at points that you would find much more naturally at an office. I'll say like if you talk to folks who want to be back at office, usually they say, "Hey, I really miss that. I miss that social aspect." That's often
Right.
what I hear from
So back during 2000, 2001, it's funny. Me and a few of my colleagues actually started getting together every Friday, and we would do like a happy hour thing. But we did it. We had just a lot of fun with it. Like there was legitimately one session where we all grabbed like a stuffed animal in our house. And what we ended up doing was we had our conversations by like removing ourselves from the camera and like coming up with the craziest background to put that stuffed animal in. And like, so we had to go hunt for something. And it was just, I mean, it was silly, but it
them.
was like these abilities to like, I still remember that because it was a connection opportunity I had with a couple of my colleagues. I was like, that wasn't anything work related, but it
Yeah.
was fun. Like we had a blast. Yeah, yeah, there you go. Exactly.
For anyone watching on YouTube, you can see my little tea cat right now that I keep on my desk. It's now replacing me in the stream here. I love it.
Exactly. We're all gonna come up. I'm gonna go put my little pig with glasses.
Oh, I dig
Now we're
that.
gonna do that.
Yeah. And I think we lose a lot of that connection sometimes,
Yeah.
unless you're intentional about it. Like my team,
Well,
we maintain like a 30-minute weekly meeting just to BS. And sometimes in that meeting, I'm like, oh, why am I here? But it's conversations like this that remind me how important that is, where we need to talk about, the silly TV show I'm watching or what
exactly. Who
movie.
caught the last episode of,
Yeah. Like,
was it
have you
the
seen
Rings
Rings
of
of Power?
Power? What do you
No,
think of
I
that?
heard.
Let's talk about it.
Okay, I'll admit, I thought I felt a little let down. I'm super stoked it's gone, but I thought
I
the
haven't
writing
finished the second episode yet. I got cut off
I
halfway through, and I'm like, all right, I see what they're doing here, but
yeah.
it'll be interesting.
Okay.
So one thing I'll share too, so anyone out there watching or listening to this, if you're struggling at all to find the human connection, there's another thing, another technique I want to share. Just as again, you could do something like something silly with Zoom, but if you need something structured, we actually have an activity in our team playbook with Atlassian called my user manual. And it's a whole thing where you basically write out a page that talks about a little bit about who you are
Yeah.
and, everything from, a little bit about you and how you work, but then also, what do you like? What are the things you're passionate about? And I ran this with one of our customers back maybe 2 months ago, and they were a pretty close team. They were actually a group that were all in office together, post-pandemic, so they knew each other fairly well, but we ran it, and all of a sudden, you start finding things out, like this one guy was a big fan of Frisbee golf, and the one of the managers was like, "I didn't know you like that." And he's like, "Yeah, I go every weekend." He's like, "Hey, we should totally go, like, I'm into that too." And they started making these connections that they just never thought they never realized, and so being intentional. And I love that word. It's one of my favorite words is intentional. They use this structure to just become a little bit intentional about learning about each other. Super simple exercise. Just went through, filled out a page, and then they went around the horn and presented. It was great. So if you're looking for structure, that's a easy technique you do just to unleash a little bit of humanity into your conversations.
I love that. I've done a user manual exercise before as well,
Have you?
and I really enjoyed it. And for that one, it was like I was joining a team, and they said, "Hey, write
Mhm.
write your user manual. We want to learn about you." It was like a fun icebreaker exercise, and they all had theirs like when they joined the team. Like, "Oh, here's mine," and
Mhm.
it was enjoyable. I think there was definitely like context you got out of it. It was really nice.
Yeah, you start learning about it. And actually what you just talked about is actually a great way to do with those is new people come in, just make it part of your rituals as a team. You have it posted out there. Actually this team I was telling you about, they loved it so much that what they did in Confluence is they actually went in and they built out like a section says this is
Oh,
where all
I
our
did the
user manuals
conflict
are so they can
sections.
share
Yeah,
it with the
yeah,
world.
yeah.
And they'd be like, yeah, it's like that's who we are.
And this speaks to really creating like a human-centric team climate, I think,
Yep.
where it's not just about the work, but also, I mean, we have a panel at Interact on October
Yep.
25th, to plug it once again, talks about like treating death as human beings. And I know that it's kind of overblown sometimes. Like, oh, of course, but no, people get treated like cogs in this work machine far too often.
Yep. Oh yeah, it's like, why, I need you to get this done by this point in time, and then they come back, it's like, "Is this done yet?" It's like, "Well, I had these things happen. It just isn't done yet." All of a sudden, you start stripping out the humanity there,
I
Like,
feel
yeah,
guilty
we're
with that. I'll admit.
yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
same. Back in my prior lives, it's one of those things you almost and you sit back and you reflect on, you're like, "Wow, what was I thinking?" But it's easy to get caught up in those sorts of things.
Yeah. So, what are other ways you can help build that kind of human-centric team climate?
I think one of the other big things that can help do that is helping to kind of encourage things like innovation within the team. I think innovation in the team helps to kind of help people bring unique aspects of themselves in. Again, brings that those unique ideas, and so by going through an encouraging environment where you can share ideas, you can go and feel free to like push back or say, "Hey, I think we can do this better." That's a huge piece.
And you need psychological safety to be able to feel comfortable
Oh,
doing that.
100%. Connor, I got a question for you here
Yeah.
too, because I knew we were going to talk about this at some level. Is when was the last time you and your team reflected or retrospected as a team?
When's the last time we did a retro? I'm happy I can say it was last week because we had an offsite
Nice.
and we did a retro on some of the stuff we've been working on. But I think it really depends from team to team and
Yeah.
we're not consistent about it, I'll say.
Well, and one of the and I asked that because one of the first signs you look for in terms of that innovation is one, do you do it? But then more importantly, do you act upon it? And is it a culture where you feel like that's the idea? We've actually found that 97% of teams that work within an organization where things like reflection and taking action is encouraged actually are considered very innovative. Like people feel like it's an innovative culture because guess what? The behaviors of the organization that are being encouraged are that of, hey, let's think back, let's take action, and let's try something else. And so this flavor of innovation starts kind of coming to life because we're encouraging psychological safety by allowing people to speak up. We're encouraging the idea of trying new things and this idea that don't be afraid to fail because guess what? We're never going to get it right the first time. But what we can do is learn fast.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And that kind of fast iteration is
Mhm.
really crucial, right? Like there's so much of modern engineering that says in order to become stable, you move quickly because that
Yep.
iterative cycles is how you improve. But it's also true for team dynamics, to your point. Is you
Mhm.
need to learn quickly and adjust. And I think the part that gets ignored a lot is people say, "Oh, we got to move fast," but then they don't do that retrospective piece. To your point of like, okay,
Yep.
how can we adjust? How can the team get better?
Yeah, we don't need to do this week. It's, okay, we'll pass on that, And then, most of the times, why that happens is it's because, we get together and we talk about it. We don't ever really do anything about it.
Mhm.
And so all of a sudden it's the same conversation. So the moment that it just feels like we're just going into some good group therapy, we're like, we can skip therapy this week. We'll come back a future week. So I think it goes back into actually good, at my prior life as like a scrum master, a coach, these sorts of things, it was imperative to help make sure that they were like, we saw those inches. We saw the things come out of those things because then all of a sudden the team was asking for it because they said, you know what? I realize that when I engage in this conversation, we actually get better. We actually change things. And it's like, yeah, like
Yeah,
that's the culture we want to build.
I think that alignment's super important of like, hey, we actually see the value of this because
Mhm.
by looking at the data from this Atlassian report, it says 57% of participants in the study said their team isn't operating efficiently. And if you're in
Yes.
that, almost 60% of people who think their team has efficiency issues, your instinct is probably, oh, like this is kind of
Mhm.
BS. We just need to like do the work. We got to execute. And yet, if you strip away that retrospective element, that like thoughtful element of, hey, how are we doing? How can we improve? You're just going to execute a lot in an inefficient way.
I think one of the big things there too is you think about that figure there. Like more than half of our surveyed participants believe that they're not working effectively or efficiently. One of the biggest elements that comes into that is this idea that, you know what, we're wasting our time. And a lot of that time is that feeling of being of wasted is in things like meetings that don't make sense. Or, you had brought up earlier the whole like, how do we work asynchronously? Instead of getting on Zoom for everything we do, we figure out a new way, a new ritual of how we actually collaborate differently. Because all of a sudden, I think you've probably gone through it. I know I have over the last year this feeling of Zoom fatigue, this aspect where
Oh, yeah.
I feel like I bounce back to back to back, and then I don't feel like I get anything done. And so of course I don't feel effective. Of course I don't think I'm getting stuff done.
Particularly if you move into something where it's either external facing or
Yes.
leadership facing, where you start getting all these one on ones, right? You say, okay, like now I'm leading a team of six and I have to have a one on one with everyone every week. Even if those are
Mhm.
30 minutes, that's 2.5 hours there of meeting time just got added. Plus, suddenly you're probably in more leadership meetings where,
Yep. Now you're in meetings up here, your meetings over here, your meetings over there,
yeah,
and all of a sudden you look at your calendar and you're like, "Wow, when am I actually supposed to get other stuff done? When can I invest honestly in both yourself as well as follow ups from those one on ones?" I think one of the biggest things as a people leader that in one of my last gigs as a people leader, I would have my one on one with folks, but then it was all the work afterwards to help kind of
totally.
find out, hey, how do I help that
Yeah,
person
you
now
told me
based
this
off that
issue.
feedback?
How do I then
Yep.
take that and actually apply it? Maybe you
Yep,
told
yeah,
me you
if I
want to
don't got
develop.
time, all of a sudden, I'm just going in and be like, "Ooh, sorry, I couldn't get that done for you." How does that make you feel as an employee, And now all of a sudden you start getting into engagement problems and stuff like that. It's a domino effect.
Yeah, and one-on-ones should be time for your team, but they're also a form of retrospective, I would say,
Yes.
to your point. And so, like, great, you're doing them, but if you don't then apply those learnings to the iterative process we mentioned, is your team actually
Mhm,
improving?
mhm, exactly, and that's where I think that's where there's some reinvention that is definitely needed as we think about some of these new modern ways of working. We're not trying to completely change things, but we wanna say, "Hey, based on our current circumstances, how can we do this better? How can we think about, hey, we're going to be doing whether it be team meetings or things like that beforehand? I remember getting into a staff meeting and we'd all come together, into the big conference room and we'd BS for 15 minutes and then we'd jump into things. That's sometimes difficult when we think about the remote experience. So we think about now, well, what were the things that we got out of that? What were the outcomes we sought? And now, are there different ways we can do that? Maybe in the end, there's not even a need for a weekly staff meeting. Maybe we say, hey, you know what? We can update these few places. We're now going to have a 15-minute dance party that happens during that time. So we're all just going to have to get
That's
together and have a
fun.
great time.
Honestly, I'm about to like turn my standing desk up.
I
That's
know, right?
music. Yeah.
Exactly.
Um, so I guess I'm curious then. So Atlassian, is your culture, would you call it docs focused then with Confluence, where you centralize there, that meetings are more for like either collaboration or connection? How have you and your teams like approached it internally?
I would say we're very docs focused, but we still struggle with things like meetings.
Yeah.
Honestly, we still are working our way through that, especially as we've grown. Because one of those signs of getting larger is now you've got to try to make different connections. And one of those ways as we've gotten bigger over the years is people having meetings to try to build
The
connections. But
cross-functional
we're starting
meetings.
to
Yeah.
find what was that?
The cross-functional meetings where like maybe
Oh,
we
yeah,
talk
exactly. It's
product
like we got to connect
about
these
this.
groups together
Yeah.
here. Well, and one of the things that I've appreciated a lot about Atlassian culture is that because it's lead asynchronously. That's really like the motto that's been brought in is, hey, you know what? If you got an idea out there, go throw it in a Confluence page, blast it out, and actually have people provide you feedback before you just go and try to present an idea, waste a bunch of time collecting feedback there, and then have to go back and do it again. So if we can reduce, there still might be a meeting needed, but can we reduce it by one and say, hey, we're going to do some pre-work beforehand? I've also seen one of my favorite techniques that I got exposed to here at Atlassian in my last 3 years. That it's like one of those things where it's like aha, I'm like, why didn't I ever do that before? Was what we'd do is we'd actually start meetings out knowing that if we had a doc, sometimes we'd send it out beforehand and nobody would read it. And I think we've all been there. What we do is take first 15 minutes of the meeting says, all right, everybody, especially now in a remote world, go read the document, add your comments, your thoughts, go through it. So it's a silent reading for the first 15 minutes. And then we spend the remaining time, and when maybe you have only 15 more minutes, if you got a half hour, going through the comments with the idea is like you've instructed people to kind of say, these are the type of things I'm looking for as you're commenting through here. And so then as a group, we can kind of, go back and forth on the comments. So no longer are we kind of going into a meeting and hoping, someone says, yeah, I kind of read it. I looked at the titles. Now we've actually all done it and we can have actually a generative conversation out of it. It's no longer we no longer going to need a meeting after the meeting because then people are actually going to do the work. So one of my favorite techniques that we've been that has present here that I'm taking into everything I go to.
I love that. And I appreciate the kind of actionable takeaways you're bringing to this episode of the show. Definitely something we love. And
It's all about the inches, right?
yeah,
Hey, if anyone watching or listening out here, your goal is find those inches.
I think I'm going to have my team do operations manuals or operators manuals and put them into Confluence. You said that.
Yeah, do it.
And I was thinking of that as you talked about, I was like, oh, they put this in Confluence. And you mentioned, I'm like, yeah, like we could do
Yep.
that. Like that would be easy.
Yeah, and
And
then
useful.
just to your point earlier, as people join, all of a sudden it becomes part of how your team works. It becomes part of your culture
Yeah.
because it's part of your behaviors of like, hey, yeah, you join. Actually, an interesting thing we do at Atlassian is this idea of an introduction blog post. And so when we come in, it's less about the user manual. We still will do that within our own internal teams, but when you join the company, we have like if you go into Confluence, there's even a blog post template. We go write a blog post, our first blog post, and it's just talking about who we are. What's our background? What do we love? What are the things? I remember in there, I have pictures of me and my kids. I've got a picture of some bread I baked at one point because I was super fixated on baking at one point in my life. And then
Almost
there was
like,
like a trip with my wife,
yeah.
And so like it allowed me to introduce myself as a person versus a job title, and so everyone does it. And what's really even neat is that like one thing I like to do on Mondays is I come in the morning and in our on Confluence homepage for us. When we come in, that's your first place you stop to. There's a section of new blogs and there's a, just top blog, but then there's also intro blogs. So I don't have to just take 30 minutes while I'm drinking my coffee and just scroll through the intro blog. Software engineer in India. There's a new product marketing manager in the UK, or someone I found someone who's just down the road from me in Michigan. I'm like, oh, cool. And so I said, hey, welcome.
That's really cool. I love that idea, especially for an organization that's scaling like Atlassian has
Mhm.
to be that size where you still have this human connection you can develop, which to your
Yeah,
point earlier is hard.
it really is. You got to be intentful. Well, there's that word again, right?
So Mark, this is all great. I mean, the data is super interesting. The takeaways are great. What is it you plan to bring to Interact? Like, what's that sneak peek
Ooh.
that you can give us about what folks are going to hear from you on October 25th?
So one of the things I know y'all had asked me back when we started talking about this is like, and I had mentioned this idea that we're getting our latest state of teams coming out here, is that's going to release at the very beginning of November. And so he says, is there any way we can get a sneak peek? I think I can make that happen. And so what you're going to get here, so if you tune in for Interactive, you're going to get a sneak peek at some of the data we have in our latest state of teams. And the way I like to summarize it after looking through it and kind of thinking about how I want to present this out to y'all is that things have finally started to settle. If we think about it, it's been about a year since, things like coming back to the office has happened. A lot of that noise is starting to kind of die down in media. And what we're finding is that there's settling that's happening, just like a foundation. And there's a little bit of fallout from the new modern ways of working, these new ways we're doing out that we may not have expected. So, my goal is going to share with you a couple of the fallout areas that we're seeing. So, some of those things that we didn't expect would happen are actually happening, and how we deal with that. Think about things like, I'll just put a teaser out there. Think about things like, how does imposter syndrome play out in a world where we're remote most of the time? So it's going to be fascinating.
So does this apply to the unusual suspects data that I know
Oh,
Atlassian has done as well?
yeah. So for the listeners and the watchers out there, so as part of our state of teams that we came out with just this last year, so back earlier this year, we actually came out with a supplemental report that I think we could probably post this somewhere as
Okay.
associated with the blog or with the podcast. But we found four kind of anomalies in our data where we were looking through it. And we said, hey, wow, there's some really interesting trends, and it has to do with what we're calling the unusual suspects. And those are basically data points that we found that were, unusual. Things like this idea of a bad apple. So I think when I say bad apple, a lot of people probably are like, I think I know what that means. But think about those people who like kind of pull the team down, those people who are actively disengaged. It's interesting because based on our data, we found that out of 26% of those people we talked to said that they had a bad apple in their group. And there's impacts to that. There's think about things like turnover and stuff like that. Another one of those unusual suspects was this idea of what we call the human torch. It's burnout. 28% of people of the last 6 months have reported these symptoms of burnout here. So when we experience things like checking Slack in the middle of the night, tisk tisk, Connor.
I'm so
Those are
guilty.
things that lead to the human torch. And so all this, and one actually an interesting fact here, I think it was somewhere around like 48% of individuals who actually had like high caregiving needs too. So maybe they had families they took care of too at home, or other family members. They were 48% more likely to experience
Wow.
burnout. So you can see where that continually grows. So the human torch is something I think we can all relate to at
All
some
right. So
level,
bad
especially with
apples,
this
human
moment.
torch. What else we got
Yep.
here?
So next one up on our list, as you scroll on down here, it's the flight risk. Now, this is fascinating. So the flight risk is interesting because what we found is that 28% of not just people, but leaders, so the managers, the people who set the tone in the organization, are considering quitting in the next 3 months. So and this is where it's kind of scary. The leaders, the first ones we talked to earlier, they can help set the behaviors. They can help generate the environment. And if they're already planning on leading it, how the heck are we going to support a team in that
And
environment?
what kind of
So,
behaviors are rolling down from them around?
yeah, all of a sudden I see my bosses, leaving. I'm like, ooh, what does that say for me at that point?
All right.
So that was a fascinating point there. And the last one, this last one here is I think something that honestly the remote aspect has led to at some level. And this idea of, I kind of mentioned it earlier, a little bit of the mask, a little bit of the, always okay, hey, yeah, we're just cordial with each other because we don't know each other completely as humans. But this idea that as teams are trying to innovate on ideas, teams find that themselves 9% less likely to come up with new ideas if they're super connected all the time. It means that all of a sudden we're too cordial with each other. We're too bond, it's almost like there's not enough friction in the group. And
Where's
I
the
find
dude?
that things like, yeah, exactly. If all of a sudden we're agreeing with each other all the time. So, we're not kind of butting
All right.
heads a little bit.
Got it. Okay.
Where does, what is it, diamonds come out of pressure,
Yeah.
and so where's the pressure? Where's the tension here? So that was another interesting area that kind of came out, was this aspect that, wow, teams that are connected, awesome. They're finding that connection, but they're not generating new ideas because they're just I don't know, they haven't shared their full self. And so they're struggling to put on anything more than maybe that first level of professionalism.
And I think to your point, I believe the report said 56% of teams had poor connection and alignment in the key problem areas that you identified.
That's basically the largest area that led to poor team health was
Interesting.
poor connection and alignment. And really that means connection to each other, but then also connection to the organization and its goals. So one of the big things that I'm super passionate about is how do we help teams understand their purpose, their mission, what is it that they do and why do they do it? Even if I'm just even if I'm just building a set of like services in the background, or maybe I'm an operations team, these folks who may not be building the sexy UI that goes out there, what is it the value you bring to the table? And so that lack of alignment goes back to not really understanding where I fit into the puzzle, maybe not understanding the goals of the organization and how my work contributes to that. So we've got to get better. And this goes back to leadership. We got to get better at how do we honestly tell our teams really energizing stories around the impacts that we're making.
Yeah, that shared understanding of the team's goals and each person's
Mhm.
role in pursuing them is really important. It's something I'll say I hear from a lot of the best leaders that come on this podcast. They say, hey, you need your engineers to understand not just what the feature they're doing is, but also how it affects the customer, how it's driving business bottom line, because that helps people understand their impact. And if engineers are thinking that and the people who are actually building the products who are, putting things at play, that absolutely, the entire or all teams need to be thinking about, okay, like,
Oh,
what
yeah.
impact I'm
Well, it leads to better products too,
having.
it leads to that aspect, especially in the engineering world. I remember this, working with teams, we would always try to get to like, why are we doing this? It's not just about go build this new. I remember working for a financial firm, and they wanted us to build a new API to connect into with some subsidiary financial companies, and we're like, why are we trying to do that? And we ended up finding out that they all actually wanted to aggregate data for a customer so they could see it all in one place. And so, you know what? They thought we had to develop this new, service to do that. We're like, we already get that data over here. And they're like, you do? They're like, yeah, we could just tap right into it. And so all of a sudden it became an issue where we actually saved money and time because we understood what we were trying to do versus just being order takers, because you're not going to get what you want if you're just putting down what they say.
So I like that we're thinking about like cross-functional communication, understanding goals. We've talked about, constructive feedback, retros, opportunities to reflect in this, like, I'll call it a blame-free environment.
Yeah.
What about like celebrating achievement? How do you think about that and impact on teams?
So I think one of the things we don't do enough these days, and even our data talks about this too, is we don't do enough celebrating. We Back in the day, we would have opportunities to do some of that. I feel just naturally through being together, something awesome happens. Cool, great job. But the thing is as we kind of moved out and kind of distributed, all of a sudden that kind of almost camaraderie that would happen where we say, oh, we did this thing kind of went away. Now you get some things like you have, like we use Slack at Atlassian. And so you have that ability to go into a Slack room and be like, oh, this is a great thing. But it's not a muscle that many of us have trained ourselves on fully. And so finding opportunities to celebrate the accomplishments and honestly not like put down for the failures, find ways to how do we learn from our failures. It's one of those things that although it's as old as time, it's still as true as always. It's like we've got to continue to find ways to encourage people, find people, it's part of the engagement problem. How do we help people engage? As we say, we help them see the impact they're making and honestly celebrate the impacts that they've made. And so for me, things like opportunities to celebrate, even small ones too. And one of the things actually I used to do as a people leader was actually find out from my people, how do they like to be celebrated? Some people love, getting out there and having being celebrated out wide. Some teams love that too. But some people, they're not a big fan of that. And so going out there and finding out, how do you like to be celebrated and being able to do that for your people. It goes miles in terms of that engagement and that support, just that feeling that, hey, I'm with a group of people that I truly enjoy working with.
I think that's a great recognition. And it's something I keep on referencing the best leaders come on this podcast, but that they do the same thing where it's like when someone comes on
Yeah.
our team, they figure out how does this person want to be communicated with? How can I celebrate them that
Yep.
is impactful for them? And then they continue to repeat that. And
Yep.
Mark, I can't thank you
It's
enough.
all about the follow through, right?
Yeah, I can't thank you enough for all these great takeaways and pieces. 'Cause I know a lot of the leaders and people, potential leaders who are listening to this show will take this and say, okay, like, how can I apply this to my team? So this is a great way to go about it. And we can't wait to have you at Interact too.
It's going to be great. And I will say for your listeners and your watchers out there, and if you're looking for cool ways of how to improve your team, again, look for the inches and go look at things like I mentioned the Atlassian team playbook. Great, a lot of great plays you can go try out there just to try to find those little opportunities. Things like Management 3.0, great way of how do you help think about things like how do we work in more of a modern way. So I want to make that last plug, and I can't wait to come and speak at Interact here in October because I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation we're going to have around. All right, we're here now. What?
Well, Mark, can't wait to have you back for Interact and to hear more in depth about the data that Atlassian's seeing and get that sneak peek. Look forward to seeing you
Mhm.
there. And thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Connor. This was great. Thanks all.